Okay, so it's the last hurdle for tonight. It's the last intellectual hurdle, so we'll do it. Okay, so my title is What Makes Us Human. I want to focus on Augustine. You have the paper, and I invite you to follow what I shall be presenting tonight, this evening. So this paper seeks to answer the question, what makes us human, from a theological and a phenomenological point of view. What shall be presented here is the other side of the coin to what has already been referred to and emphasized in the light of biology, physics, neuropsychology, neuroscience, and many other sciences in general. Concisely, in the reference to Augustine, one of the early Christian thinkers will claim that a person's consciousness and awareness, and I would add disposition, just to introduce also some kind of mysticism and spirituality in this conference, of one's whole in relation to the self. That happens in relation to the self, so that's the interiority, in relation to the others, exteriority, and in particular to God, Augustine would say. And that would be the appropriate answer, at least in the Christian tradition. The principal characteristic of Augustine's philosophy and theology is that only when the whole person turns toward the truth that it becomes available to him or her. This thought is captured in his axiom that unless we believe, we shall never understand. So I'm presenting a theological perspective. God's revelation, even though of a mysterious nature, is considered foundational and credible through a much-needed engagement between reason and faith. In Augustine's eyes, faith and reason are not two reconcilable camps. They are never to be opposed. On the contrary, they are meant to complement each other in the same manner that a person who seeks the truth is not simply a disembodied mind. The complementary dimension between reason and faith must take place in a whole being. One's wholeness, to recall the Greek term pleroma used by the Church Fathers, and Augustine was one of them in the Western tradition, in the light of one's readiness and ability to think and speak out one's mind, but also to remain silent before the mystery of life, become decisive to present an answer to our preliminary question. Interiority as a fundamental principle. Augustine's philosophy is centered on the desire to seek the truth that takes place within his own self. Augustine is manifestly conscientious towards restless individuals adrift in a world that gives them little or no support. This is his experience, marked by a series of conversions, intellectual and religious ones. He says, I quote, "Is not a human person's heart an abyss? For what abyss is deeper? It is night, because here the human race wanders blindly." Close quote. Undoubtedly, through Augustine, the Christian tradition follows early Greek philosophy that emphasizes interiority. In this scenario, nonetheless, Augustine's psychology and personality are not easily grasped, even more so when he describes himself as a man who writes as he progresses and who progresses as he writes. And in fact, we will notice that he would have changed the definition or understanding of the human person. Augustine was neither the first nor the only ancient philosopher to examine the theme of interiority. The Neoplatonists, Plotinus in particular, had already developed a whole language of interiority. Most probably, Augustine discovered interiority as a philosophical principle through his reading of books by Platonist disciples. This is in fact attested in Book 7 of the Confessions. These readings were imperative in the sense that they led him to the path of the return to the self. By this, Augustine understood the inner movement that enabled him to discover the spirituality and the logical conviction of the searcher as beloved in front of God. This quest for interiority had in fact liberated him from Manichaeism. Augustine narrates this when he says, "And being thence warned to return to myself, I entered into my inward self, thou leading me on. And I was able to do it, for you had become my helper. And I entered, and with the eye of my soul, such as it was, saw above the same light of my soul. above my mind the unchangeable light. Not like this was that light, but different, very different from all these. Nor was it above my mind as oil is above water, nor as heaven above earth. But above it was, because it made me, and I below it, because I was made by it. He who knows the truth knows that light, and he that knows it knows eternity. Love knows it. Humanity as an existential difficulty. Throughout his written works, Augustine presents a textual self. So one could think of intellectuality, of intellectualism, but he's presenting his self in terms of language. So Augustine is presenting a textual self, wherein he does not simply narrate or portray an examination of his life or intellectual convergence, but also his keen interest in the credibility or the meaningfulness of his humanity in front of others and in front of God. His yearning to reveal the inner man becomes the chief object of narration. This is neatly described in the question, who am I? What am I? Augustine intends to understand human nature through his personal eyes, through his intellect. Augustine approaches the issue of human nature from the perspective of existential philosophy. This means that his initial way to understand the nature of the human person was an experiential and a practical one. He approaches the theme of humanity with particular tools that include experience, reason, and language. Augustine's attempt to describe the mystery of his being human is characterized by an existential difficulty. This is evident in the book The Confessions, wherein he exclaims profound statements about himself and his humanity. In one instance, he says, "I have become an enigma to myself. Indeed, what makes him human? Can human nature be ever explained? Can it be examined in itself, philosophically? Or should it be analyzed in relation to God?" In other words, is the method employed in the Augustine of the Dialogues similar to the Augustine of the Confessions? After his conversion to Catholicism, Augustine presents himself in the light of truth as paradox. The more he seeks to understand himself as a person, the more he discovers himself as a land of famine and a great enigma. In his concluding chapters of the Confessions, he speaks of a much-needed recreation of his very being. One notices in Augustine a certain hesitation to answer problems arising from anthropology. He says, open quote, "I know not from where I came from into this. Shall I call it dying life, this dying life?" He continues by saying that "I have become for myself a land hard to till and of heavy sweat." Undoubtedly, there requires an intellectual struggle to determine the nature of his identity as a human person and his calling as a Christian. Alternatively, but complementarily, in his philosophical dialogues, Augustine emerges as a speechless philosopher, filled with awe in front of the mentioned existential preliminary question. For this reason, he seeks to understand the soul and God, as well as their relation to one another. This is evident in his work titled The Soliloquies. Augustine's programmatic sentence that manifests the only two themes of his philosophy, around which revolve all the other things, include God and the self. He says, "God, who is always the same, may I know myself, may I know you." Augustine's quest and its Socratic roots. One sure way to analyze Augustine's understanding of the human person must take place in view of ancient Greek philosophy. Torn by existential problems and tormented by his passions, Augustine embarked on a quest to discover himself. He was aware of the famous maxim, "Knowing thyself," which both Socrates and the Sophists held so dearly. Augustine's quest in the Confessions becomes then an attempt to philosophize in an inward manner. In this light, his is a philosophy that searches for its Socratic roots. One of the reasons why Socrates is fundamental to Augustine is his primary interest in the nature of the human person. Augustine was aware that Socrates' philosophical search was neither for a hidden God, since he is the object of faith and he was interested in that, nor for the cosmos, since the person who tries to know the cosmos would be attempting to violate the secrets of God. Alternatively, Socrates was interested in knowing the human person. This will eventually lead Augustine to walk in the footsteps of Socrates by applying two fundamental perspectives, the abstract and the historical perspectives. The first perspective presents Augustine as a philosopher who, in adhering to the thought of Neoplatonism, attempts to arrive at an abstract understanding of the human person. In this light, he was influenced by different schools of thought, including that of the Stoics, of Varro, and that of Cicero. Alternatively, the historical perspective presents an Augustine who examines the human person in the light of the scriptures and the Christian way of life. So I am emphasizing a difference between the early Augustine, the Augustine as a philosopher, the Augustine of the dialogues, and the Augustine of the confessions after his conversion. An example of the historical understanding of the human person is the biblical reference to the heart. Augustine says, "What is my own heart after all but a human heart?" To Augustine, a human person emerges as a mystery. He says, "What then am I, O my God? Or what nature am I? A life various and manifold and exceedingly vast." Thus, whereas the abstract perspective asserts that one can speak of the human person with precision and logic, this is not the case with the historical perspective after his conversion. Augustine's method of interiority means to contextualize the human person in terms of history and in terms of one's calling. In this sense, Augustine's existential point of departure then concerns the transcendence of the human person towards God, as in distinction to an understanding of him or her in abstract reasoning. According to Augustine, the human person transcends itself because he or she has an ontological and a historical dimension. Nonetheless, for Augustine, the human person, embedded in the past and the future, remains an enigma. He explains that neither the spirit of the human person nor his or her restlessness can be entirely grasped or understood. The existential perspective adopted by Augustine in the Confessions is also present in earlier texts such as On Order and the Soliloquies. Here the problems or areas of concern are two. One of them is the human person, while the other is God himself. Augustine explains that knowledge of the human person is acquired once again through a method of interiority. This does not mean a reduction to subjectivism or even solipsism. On the contrary, as Socrates advises, each person comes to know himself through introversion or interiority. Augustine's philosophy can be described in this light as a theocentric anthropology, since he's interested in knowing the human person but as God's image. In this sense, Augustinian philosophy can be compared to transcendental humanism, where the human person lies at the center of reflection as a person who is capable to transcend himself or herself to get to God. José Rubén Sanabria explains that, properly speaking, for Augustine, the human person is not simply a being, but rather a being in relationship. It must be clear that while such an explanation might seem a religious theme or a Christian theme, nonetheless this reveals an expression of mystical philosophy of a Stoic and Neoplatonic inspiration. Let's move on to the Aristotelian influence. This brings us to another factor in Augustinian thought on the human person, and that is Aristotle. Here reference is made to the concept of the soul and its immortality. In the dialogue titled The Immortality of the Soul, serving as the third and final book to the Soliloquies, Augustine is interested in the question of how the soul can remain immutable even though it moves the body. In the footsteps of the Greek master, Augustine identifies three dimensions of the human person. These are vita seminalis, or the vegetable life, vita sensualis, or the sensuous life, and vita intellectualis, the intellectual life. Augustine explains that the human person, gifted with a soul, is not only a living substance characterized by vita seminalis and vita sensualis, but also a vivifying principle. The soul represents the life principle of the human person, that is, the source of his or her physical unity, which hinders physical dissolution and regulates the vegetative functions of nutrition, growth, and procreation. Augustine confirms this when he says, the soul, through its presence, gives life to this earthly and mortal body. He continues that the quality of the union of the soul and body remained a mystery all his life, for Augustine as well as for the philosophers after him. His point is that the soul possesses an identity that in some way, in some sense, transcends time. In the words of Roy Bettenhouse, it can remember the past, promote future ends, retain constancy of purpose, and remain the same soul. The vita intellectualis of the human soul includes three main faculties: memory, intelligence, and will. Augustine explains that these are not separated essences, but all three participate in the substantiality of the soul. To Augustine, nothing can separate the rational soul from timeless truth. This idea is later expressed more clearly. He says, these three, therefore, memory, intelligence, will, are not lives, but one life, not three souls, but one soul, and consequently not three substances, but one substance. Close quote. Furthermore, whatever is immutable is eternal, and true according to Augustine. Since truth exists only in reason, he concludes that reason, in its highest degree, is to be found only where the highest immutability is, namely in God. Augustine explains that the mind can possess wisdom in turning toward the source of its being, and can lose it by turning away from it. He explains that God takes care of the soul, and thus the soul cannot be forced by him to be changed into a body. Augustine uses and implements one of the arguments which Plato had used to demonstrate the immortality of the soul. The soul must have a creator, and no other than the one being communicates to his creator. The soul cannot admit its opposite, which is death, but rather finds its meaning in God. This leads us to consider different definitions by which Augustine seeks to understand the human person. Augustine's four definitions. Before we move on to distinguish among his four different definitions, we need to make clear that there are diverging opinions with regard to Augustine's understanding and definition of the human person. These naturally explain and justify the plurality of definitions that Augustine included in his writings. The first position is that Augustine's anthropology is marked by Platonic dualism throughout all his work until his last published book. Here the emphasis lies on his reliance on Platonic dualism. In other words, Augustine's understanding of the human person is thoroughly Platonic, and that is the body and the soul. The second position holds that Augustine's definition of the human person is characterized by an evolution of his thought. So supporters of this claim argue that Augustine was initially Platonic, but ended up presenting a unitary vision. In short, there is a shift in Augustine's understanding that emphasizes unity rather than duality. The third position emphasizes that Augustine's anthropological insights are unitary right from the start. In simple words, the human body is composed by the soul and the body. I'll conclude my presentation by going through these four definitions, because this is the essence of Augustine after all. On the topic. With these three perspectives in mind, the sound contextualization of his four definitions of the human person takes place. In this light, by the human person, Augustine understands the unity of the body and soul. He understands the human person as a rational, mortal animal. A third definition would be a soul that makes use of the body. And lastly, the human person as a certain kind of substance, sharing in reason, fitted to rule the body. The first one, the human person as the unity of the body and soul. Studying the influence of Varro on Augustinian anthropology, Nello Cipriani argues that when Augustine speaks of the supreme good, his mention of the human person refers to the unity of the body and soul. In the analysis of Book 19 of the City of God, Cipriani explains that there can be neither the soul without the body, nor the body without a soul. Instead, the soul and the body stand together. In this light, Augustine has rejected the Manichaean understanding of the human person and has accepted Varro's theory of the prima natura. This refers to the primary goods relative to the body and the soul, and to that of virtue, which is the most excellent and good. In simple words, Augustine reconsidered corporality, which the Manichaeans unhesitantly condemned and which Neoplatonists underestimated. The second definition, the human person is a rational, mortal animal, and this is the most simple definition that Augustine gives. The second definition that Augustine gives is that the person is rational, mortal animal. This is found in his text on order. The term rational is used to distinguish the human person from brute animals, while mortal to distinguish the human person from God. Augustine explains that unless it holds fast to the rational element, it will be a beast. Unless it turns aside from the mortal element, it will not be divine. In this way, therefore, this definition succinctly expresses the unity of soul and body that make up the human person. The third definition, the human person as a soul that makes up use of the body. This reasoning has led Augustinian scholars to claim that there is a clear dualism between the body and the soul. In this light, this definition would be totally opposed to that of Varro. This is then a difference in the thought of Augustine as exemplified in his book text on order written in 386 and in his of the morals of the Catholic Church and on the morals of the Manichaeans written in 388. Nonetheless, these two definitions are not mutually exclusive, because that on order defines the human person in terms of his specific difference composed of the soul and the body, while of the morals of the Catholic Church speaks of the human attitude in relation to the supreme good and defining the human person as a soul that makes use of the body. The last definition to conclude, Augustine defines the human person as a certain kind of substance sharing in reason fitted to rule the body. From his early works, Augustine explains that of its nature, the soul refers to a relationship to the body. The soul seeks to give life to the body and to possess it. This is certainly different from what Platonism believes. Platonism treats the body as a negative element to which the soul must free itself through a series of reincarnations to return then purified to the One. For Augustine, the soul is not of the same divine substance as was claimed by the Neoplatonists. Augustine explains that the soul has been created by God and similar to Him, and given to animate the body and govern it. In this sense, the body is different from the soul, but the body to the soul is indispensable for it to be called a human person. Augustine expresses the same idea in a different work. He says, "Who can reasonably offer a complaint because the soul was given to move and manage the body, since an order of things so great and so divine could not be better linked together? If the soul is meant to be in close relationship to the body, then the body cannot be considered as a prison of the soul, as is held by Plotinus or Porphyry. Rather, the soul unites the body to itself in a way that it gives life and sets it free from sin to be eventually united to God. I'll skip to the conclusion. So Augustine was initially inspired by Plato, claiming that the human person has two substances, the soul and the body, opposed as light and darkness, good and evil. But alternatively, Augustine emphasizes that man is a rational substance consisting of soul and body. So the body and the soul are united in one body. Secondly, Augustine prefers moving from an abstract understanding of the human person to a more grounded historical understanding. So he prefers to understand the human person in terms of tranquility of order and in terms of the order of love. So in contrast to the modern era, where the human person has been described in terms of useless passion, to quote Sartre, or absurdity or libido, Augustine insists that the human person is passion, power, strength, and love. Thirdly, with the Aristotelian influence, Augustine passes to discuss the human person as an indissoluble unity of the soul and the body. So the human person consists of a whole being, mind and will, thought and affection, sense and heart, nature and the supernatural. And this is true recently, especially in the Italian circles, I'm thinking of Pierangelo Sequeri, who is a recent theologian who is emphasizing that for many centuries we have been emphasizing the intellect and the will, and perhaps now it's time to emphasize also the affectus, not in terms of sentiments, but in terms of freedom, in terms of dignity of the person, in terms of relationship with one another, and also to claim back the virtue of trust. Lastly, knowing the human person comes through an entering into self. Redo inte ipsi, would say Augustine. So to Augustine, the process to know the human person entails the ability to transcend the realm of exterior to what the human person is. So he would claim that we need to go into oneself. Ramiro Flores identifies this as a meditation or a reflection of self-awareness in contrast to a simple remembering. And he says, man does not know himself. Now, for acquiring this self-knowledge, he needs a constant habit of withdrawing from things of the senses and of concentrating this thought within himself and holding it there. So basically, I wanted to emphasize that in the end, Augustine's method to identify the human person is basically to enter in relationship to others and to God in terms of exteriority, but in the end, he emphasizes the method of interiority because it is experiential, it is equally reasonable, and he could engage with a textual self. And one would realize that Augustine the philosopher, where he reasons, for instance in his book De Soliloquies, where he reasons with himself, so there is a dialogue going on between Augustine as a person and reason personified. That kind of dialogue is now transposed in his book The Confessions, where there is no longer reason personified, but now there is God, and he sees as such a certain equality. So reason personified could also be called God. And on that note, I conclude my presentation.